Horror is a prominent genre in gaming since the industry saw the light of day, and for many people, it's basically the reason why they joined the world of gaming in the first place. But even though the genre is so rich and diverse, I think it's fair to say that the last 10 years were obviously the golden age for indie horror games specifically. This was all triggered by the cancellation of PT in 2014, when people became insanely obsessed with finding a similar experience that could replace it. As a result, solo developers felt for the first time that they could really provide something that a massive audience wants. And it was also a chance for them to go mainstream by competing on making the best PT-like game possible. This led to an overwhelming flood of indie horror games in the following years, many of which were genuinely terrifying and, some might argue, even surpassed PT in quality. However, in recent years, it seems like this wave is slowly fading away, and the genre has been losing momentum after hitting its peak years ago. I mean, these days, it's literally rare to find an indie experience that genuinely matches PT's atmosphere, even though we used to get such games regularly in the past. So the real question is, what the heck happened? And why now does it feel so difficult to come across an indie horror game that seriously leaves you stunned, rather than just being a low-effort cash-grab clone lacking originality in both visuals and storytelling? Well, this is exactly why I decided to compose this video, because I want to explain deeply what the elements behind this decline are, and why many developers lost the plot when it comes to making experiences that people really consider as horror. So without further ado, let's start. To help you understand exactly what I mean when I say the quality of indie horror games is declining, we first need to comprehend what a good indie horror game is, and what type of experience people are looking for in such small projects. First of all, you have to keep in mind that indie developers face significant limitations in mechanics when creating their games, meaning they must concentrate on specific elements to make up for those constraints. And if you ask me about the one element that I look for in every indie horror game I play, I'll tell you it's atmosphere, and most importantly, atmosphere. The atmosphere in an indie horror game is crucial because it sets the tone, builds tension, and immerses you in the experience at the same time. It works masterfully to convince you that it's way more important than action, gameplay, and even a chilling story won't be scary enough without it. For example, in a game like Wrong Floor, the entire playthrough is about 20 minutes long, and the story is basically ambiguous, yet the experience is an absolute nightmare when it comes to horror. The game takes place in a mysterious environment, and the unfamiliarity alone can create unease because you can feel lost and disoriented, which amplifies fear more and more. The main premise is that you're stuck on a building floor, and you need to find a way out. But the insane darkness around you is unbelievably realistic, and even when you find a flashlight, you still feel blind all the time. Besides that, even though the silence is unbearable here, the sound of distant footsteps, whispers, or mechanical hums is precisely designed to keep people stressed all the time, because you know for sure you're not alone, but you still can't see who's with you. No matter how much I describe it to you, playing this game by yourself is the best way to understand what I mean, because once you put the headphones on your head, the nightmare becomes much more personal. This same formula is also present in similar small horror games like Contempt, where the protagonist is unknown, the environment is a secluded house, and the story is open for interpretation. But even though you don't know what the heck you're doing here, and there's no rich gameplay mechanics, you can still feel terrified by just exploring the house. However, if we want to find a game where this experience is extremely well crafted, then From the Darkness is the undisputed champion without a shadow of a doubt. This game, ladies and gentlemen, is essentially a masterclass in psychological horror, despite its simplicity on paper. It's basically an extension of Wrong Floor, and it uses the same methods, including a confined environment like a small apartment. This means that all the horror you can go through will happen behind the walls of this tiny space. And the purpose behind this is to isolate you with claustrophobia and vulnerability. What we know is that this apartment is supposedly owned by your late grandfather, and your mission is to find a photo album and leave as fast as you can. But the problem is that you're not alone here, despite the quietness. And what's even scarier is that whoever is with you is seeing you from somewhere while you're completely lost. This feeling of being watched all the time creates paranoia in your mind, especially when you start witnessing changes in the environment, like lights turning off and on, doors closing on their own, and a TV working randomly. The music in the background here is a literal stress machine, and it's mainly a dissonant soundtrack that heightens tension and makes you feel uncomfortable, even though it's calm and peaceful. This is crazy, because in theory, nothing in this section should scare you. I mean, in the first half, you don't see physical threats or straightforward paranormal events. Yet this silent part is the scariest in the game, and you have no idea why. The game withholds information about its threats, leaving you to imagine the worst, and this taps into the human fear of the unknown, which is often scarier than anything explicitly shown. It sends chills down your spine without pushing you to run in a large space, and simultaneously, it convinces you of being in danger, and you have no chance to escape. This is exactly how a psychological horror game should be when the developer can't provide rich gameplay mechanics or sophisticated stories. Because if you masterfully design the proper nightmarish atmosphere, the experience can captivate the player, even if it's short, simple, and all the events are in a very, very limited space. But of course, there are other elements that a developer can rely on in an indie horror game, including an interesting story with very intriguing details. Madison, for example, is among the games that literally baffle you by how sophisticated the story is, and how piecing it together is a terrifying journey, besides the dreadful atmosphere. The story takes place in different timelines, and the characters are all related in a genius way. And even the entity hunting you is more complex than you think. You can find a similar deep plot in Devotion, where a father is living a nightmare inside his own mind, and it's mainly about his tragic memories with his family. To keep it short, this type of game was really common in the years following 2014, and they were not seen as special because there were simply multiple options every year. However, in the last 2 to 3 years, these games have become more and more rare, reaching a point where they are basically facing extinction. But if we focus enough, we'll see exactly why. As I said earlier, after the cancellation of PT 10 years ago, the market was extremely hungry for alternatives, and developers were so ready to deliver. We had many games that were directly inspired by PT, and a large portion actually succeeded in providing the closest experience possible to PT. This includes games like Misuse, where you find yourself in a similar house with a disturbing history, or Infliction, where you play as a husband confronting his regret about what he did to his wife, or Lost in Vivo, where reality and delusion intertwine in the most frightening way. But what many people don't realize is that these exceptional games we played are literally a drop of water in an ocean of indie games that were released, but people never heard of. Because with so many games competing for attention, it has become harder for new indie horror titles to stand out, leading to stagnation and decline in innovation as time passed. And when innovation fades away, many solo developers start to believe the only way to succeed is to copy the successful popular games, which leads to nothing other than repetition, countless clones, and, most importantly, over-reliance on tropes. Over time, the vast majority of games began to use the same well-worn tropes over and over again, and while these elements can be effective, their overuse has made them predictable and less powerful. The most obvious trope is none other than jump scares, which have been a staple of indie horror games, but their overuse has led to diminishing returns, and many players now find them cheap or predictable. There's a huge misconception among developers about jump scares, and many of them don't realize that jump scares are supposed to be a complementary element to the horror and not what actual horror really is. Games that rely too heavily on jump scares without building tension or atmosphere simply fail to leave a lasting impression because there's no backstory behind it in the first place. This wrong idea about jump scares among indie developers led to the creation of thousands of cheap horror games where there's no solid story, no narrative, and no atmosphere. Nothing but jump scares all over the place. As I explained in the first section, indie horror games specifically thrive on building a sense of dread and unease through atmosphere, sound design, and environmental storytelling. So overusing jump scares can ruin the entire experience by undermining this tension and prioritizing short, sudden shocks over sustained psychological horror. I mean, remember, when players expect jump scares around every corner, they become less immersed in the game's world and more focused on anticipating the next noise or sudden appearance, which breaks the sense of horror entirely. Jump scares are most effective when they catch players off guard, but if a game relies on them too frequently, you quickly learn to predict when they're coming, and this means they become useless. As humans, every one of us knows that true horror comes from the unknown, the unseen, and the psychological tension of what might happen. While jump scares, by contrast, are immediate and explicit, revealing the threat outright, which is a horrible idea for a psychological indie game with limited mechanics. Subsequently, when players encounter too many indie horror games that rely heavily on jump scares, they begin to associate the entire genre with cheap thrills and low-quality experiences, which can harm the reputation of indie horror as a whole. And by the way, this is a very big problem that the indie market has been suffering from recently. The release of so many cheap titles every day made it even harder for actual good games to catch people's attention because we subconsciously think they're the same thing. But even if we leave jump scares aside, the cloning mentality never goes away because many developers were also copying other elements blindly without understanding their effectiveness. For instance, the concept of a spooky corridor with endless loops and a scary woman in PT became common in too many experiences, even though they missed the point of their existence in PT and the profound psychological reason behind it. They don't give you a story to explain why this hallway is chilling or why you go through it in a constant cycle, but they simply put it there to try to trigger your brain to believe you're in a game similar to PT. This is such a missed opportunity because when you use this element right, like Devotion did, you can create an exceptional successor to PT where everything makes sense and you know very well why the heck you should be terrified. The same thing goes for Visage, a game directly inspired by PT, but uses the inspiration masterfully to create an even bigger, more sophisticated and scarier experience overall. It provides purpose for every element in the game, and it gives you reasons why the house is creepy, why the protagonist is mentally lost, and why there's an actual backstory behind everything you see. Found footage is another overused trope in modern indie horror gaming, and one successful game can lead to a tsunami of clones with the same visual style and the same vision, but without any additional creativity in storytelling and atmosphere. You can also notice this with mental illness themes. If one game gets it right, like Cry of Fear, dozens of other games copy it blindly and use it as a cheap source of horror, leading its influence to be completely meaningless. Overusing tropes in so many experiences caused negative stereotypes that led the genre to feel insanely homogenized. And this is why many players, including me, have a hard time distinguishing between different games recently. Simply put, the indie horror genre reached its peak years ago. And now it's going through a gradual decline because players saw all the tricks in the book, and they became so familiar with all of it, meaning there's no place in the market for games that can't be unique. However, there's another issue that many indie developers usually miss, and it also causes them to misunderstand how this specific market works. First of all, let me make it clear that I'm very aware of how indie horror began to gain momentum during the early days of games like Amnesia: The Dark Descent and Slender Man. But if we are being honest, PT was the major spark behind making this tiny genre go mainstream. And even though Let's Play videos were common before PT...
Hey, what's happening everyone? This is Yummy Mash here. Welcome back to Slender the Arrival.
You can't deny that the number has exponentially grown in the years following PT's cancellation and the revolution of psychological indie horror as we know it today. While these platforms have provided indie developers with unprecedented visibility and marketing opportunities, they have also contributed to some challenges related to the decline of indie horror gaming. I mean, make no mistake, horror games specifically are designed to be experienced firsthand, with their scares, twists, and atmosphere best appreciated when played directly. However, when streamers or YouTubers showcase the entire game for millions of people, viewers usually feel they've already experienced the game without needing to buy it. This is even more true with psychological horror games, because many people usually enjoy watching someone else play them as if it's a movie, and they also enjoy their reactions. And while this behavior is very beneficial for YouTubers, it has an opposite effect on the developer, because it can lead to lower sales for the game when people simply choose to watch instead of playing by themselves. Unlike other genres, indie horror games mostly rely on suspense, surprises, and carefully crafted reveals to provide incentive for consumers to purchase. So when these moments are broadcast to a wide audience through streams or Let's Plays, their power is entirely diminished for potential players. Furthermore, platforms like Twitch and YouTube thrive on trending content, which can also lead to a game being overexposed very quickly. This can generate huge initial buzz, but it also means that the game's popularity may peak and fade within a matter of days or weeks, leaving the developer with a product that no one cares to buy anymore. This is devastating for indie horror games more than any other genre, because they generally don't have the replayability or ongoing content updates of larger titles, which means they already suffer from a short lifespan and limited long-term sales. I mean, be honest, it's very, very rare when you replay an indie horror game after completing it yourself, let alone playing it after watching someone else go through it from start to finish. Big games from big studios can survive because they are rich with gameplay mechanics, and they can convince you to try them by yourself. But indie games can't survive because they already provide limited incentives, and their biggest ones are surprise and suspense. This is why sometimes you can find an indie game with millions of views on YouTube, despite selling an unbelievably low amount of copies and basically collecting dust on the Steam shelf. But despite this horrible dynamic, I'm noticing that developers are making it even worse by pressuring themselves to design their games with streamers and YouTubers in mind. In other words, many developers are intentionally prioritizing moments that will generate special reactions from YouTubers, rather than focusing on deep, immersive horror experiences. And this seriously pushed the quality of games to go down even lower. As a result, the jump scare games are now everywhere. The market is insanely saturated, and smaller indie developers are struggling to gain visibility, proving all the points that I made earlier because it all has a domino effect. So in summary, even though Let's Play videos are useful for exposure, they don't always translate into revenue for developers, and sometimes they can even be the last nail in the game's coffin. But let me be clear, I'm not blaming content creators. I'm just stating how this cycle works and how certain elements are related to a certain outcome. However, the story doesn't end here. If you have been paying attention to indie horror in the last 15 years, you have probably noticed that there are two types of developers in the field, and over time, the gap between the two has expanded deeply. For example, Outlast is a popular indie horror game that came out 12 years ago, and everyone agrees it's among the scariest experiences ever made. Years later, we had From the Darkness, which is also, in my opinion, among the scariest indie games I ever played. And there's something very special about it. But even though the developers behind these two games are both indie, there's still a huge difference because Outlast was made by an entire team called Red Barrels, while From the Darkness was basically made by one guy in his basement. On paper, you might assume that solo developers in general are living the dream, and their games usually succeed with less effort. But in reality, the market has literally become a graveyard for their games, and they lost control over this niche genre. I mean, even though simple ideas and cloning used to work very well for some time after PT, eventually players have come to anticipate high production values as the gaming industry evolved, and their standards started to include more polished gameplay and deeper narratives.
Give yourself up peacefully. No one has to get hurt here.
And since so many indie horror games are often made by tiny teams or solo developers with limited resources, they tend to struggle to meet these expectations, which always keeps them behind. Over time, this challenge became even harder for them because many of the indie teams who managed to produce successful games early became way bigger later on, and essentially reached the status of a multi-million-dollar studio. This is the case with Red Barrels after releasing Outlast, Frictional Games after releasing amazing titles like Amnesia and Soma, or even Bloober Team, who managed to climb the ladder with Layers of Fear, until they made their first AAA project with Silent Hill 2 Remake. But besides the growth of indie teams, some big companies also began to treat this genre much more seriously and use its inspiration to provide something that solo developers can never compete with. A game like Little Nightmares might seem like it was made by a small team, but in reality, it's actually a huge project with a huge budget and published by a gigantic publisher. It's intentionally designed to capitalize on the psychological horror market that indies rely on, while simultaneously providing mechanics that they can't emulate, meaning that competition is a losing battle for most indie developers. With that being said, there's one last thing that started to really annoy me about indie horror recently, and I believe it's also ruining the genre. In the last few years, I've started to notice a very annoying pattern in the indie horror field, which is the release of so many ultra-realistic trailers and exceptional gameplay videos of upcoming games. But these games either come out with a completely different quality, or they simply never see the light of day. These trailers usually captivate us by how chilling they are and how everything seems too good to be true. But the catch is that in many cases, the developer can't even match those expectations. A notable example is the game Ill, which had viral trailers and gameplay videos all over the place. But no one knows if it's a real game being developed or if everything is overhyped and designed to catch people's attention without any other purpose. There's also games like Wronged Us, which I have been waiting years for its release, or the Peterson case, which had a short, incredible demo in 2021 and then disappeared entirely. This even happened 10 years ago, when Allison Road made an appearance and was seen as PT's successor, and then was cancelled and never saw the light of day. The list is so long, but the common element about them is that they all felt like they were intentionally designed to cause hype, without a real plan for actually producing them, at least not with the same quality. As usual, this behavior became more common, and many trailers started to have the same formula of exaggerated visuals, scares, and sensationalism. which resulted in players feeling repeatedly misled and suspicious about what they see. You probably saw dozens of trailers like this recently, until you started wondering why they all seem very similar, and why many of them don't ever come out, besides having anonymous developers. Now, of course, some can be genuine, but the problem is that capitalizing on hype has become a common behavior in indie horror because the audience is hungry for something different. Now, in summary, guys, even though indie horror is still alive and well these days, you can't deny that it's not really improving. And instead, it's losing its charm year after year. Too many similar games made the genre feel repetitive, exaggerated marketing created mismatched expectations, and developers prioritized jump scares and gore over creativity. It all led to many games relying on tired tropes instead of exploring new ideas. And as a result, we had a saturated market where good games were lost. And as I said earlier, many big studios are trying to take advantage of people's appetite for psychological horror. And that's why we saw games like Resident Evil 7 leaning more towards that side. And we even had the Silent Hill franchise back. But in my opinion, solo developers still have a place in this space, but only if they study the market very well and realize that there's no way to stand out other than creativity, rather than repeating what was already used over and over. Anyway, make sure to give me a like and let me know in the comments below what you think about the current state of indie horror, and whether you share these concerns with me or you still believe everything is fine and there's no real decline. See you very soon.